Welcome to Banyan Books, Branches of Wisdom, celebrating the joy of bright ideas and heartful lifelong learning. Branches of Wisdom is a series of intimate conversations with the world's most influential authors and visionaries. We explore spirituality and the human mind, ecology and culture. Most episodes are recorded with a live audience. You can join our live events and submit questions to your favorite guests. Check out our upcoming schedule at banyan.com. Since 1970, Banyan Books has been a rich oasis at the crossroads of wisdom and philosophy, offering resources for humanity's evolving paths. We're a locally owned, independent bookstore in the heart of Vancouver's Kitsilano neighborhood. Visit us in person or shop online at banyan.com. Please subscribe, follow, like, and leave your reviews for the podcast. And now, enjoy.
Hello and welcome. My name is Jacob Steele, the events manager for Banyan Books and Sound. Today we're delighted to be hosting Oren Jay Sofer and Dr. Roxy Manning in conversation about Oren's new book, Your Heart Was Made for This, and Roxy Manning's new book, How to Have Antiracist Conversations. I'd like to first begin by acknowledging that although we have participants joining us from around the world, the physical location of Banyan Books is on the unceded territory of the Coast Salish peoples, including the territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh nations. Oren and Roxy welcome your questions. Please type questions into the chat box at any time during the event. And now for introductions. Oren Jay Sofer teaches meditation and communication retreats and workshops internationally. He's a member of the Spirit Rock Teachers Council. He's a certified trainer of nonviolent communication and a Somatic Experiencing Practitioner for the healing of trauma. Oren also holds a degree in Comparative Religion from Columbia University and is the author of the fantastic new book, Your Heart Was Made for This. I'm just going to bring up the title there. Your Heart Was Made for This, Contemplative Practices for Meeting a World in Crisis with Courage, Integrity, and Love. In it, Oren applies the timeless wisdom of contemplative practice to today's most pressing issues, such as the climate crisis, oppression, anxiety, and burnout. Dr. Roxy Manning is a clinical psychologist, certified Center for Nonviolent Communication trainer, and author of How to Have Antiracist Conversations and The Antiracist Heart. Since 2004, she has operated a private consulting business and regularly holds international workshops and intensives centered around nonviolent communication and social change issues. She has served as executive director of Bay Area Nonviolent Communication and focuses her outside efforts on working with the homeless population of San Francisco. How to Have Anti-Racist Conversations is about embracing our full humanity. It's a guide to having difficult conversations in a way that builds beloved community and fosters positive change. It is a great honor to have them both with us today. Please welcome Oren Jay Sofer and Roxy Manning.
Thank you, Jacob.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for having us here, Jacob, and all the folks at Banyan, and thanks to everyone who's watching and joining live. Pleasure to be here with you. So will I start, Roxy?
No, I really just wanted to also give a brief appreciation for all of the folks who are tuning in for this conversation. It's really nourishing for me, and I know for you, to have people interested in our work and to have them committed to helping do the hard work that's necessary to create peace and change in our world.
Yeah. And for those of you who don't know us or only know one of us, Roxy and I are both certified NVC trainers and teach together. We teach an 8-month training in nonviolent communication. That's a real pleasurable and rich collaboration for me. And so it's really sweet to see you again, Roxy, and be here on the call. So both of our books came out within a few months of each other. And given the kind of symbiotic relationship of our work, this kind of complementary aspects, we thought it would be fun to do some events together for our books. So the plan is I'll read a little bit from my book, and then Roxy and I might have a few comments, and then Roxy will read some from hers and the same, and we'll see where the dialogue goes from there. And then towards the end, we'll open it up for questions and comments from you. So anything else to add, Roxy, before I read a little bit?
No, that's perfect.
Okay, so I'm going to read from the introduction, which really frames the approach that I take in Your Heart Was Made for This. And there are a lot of different ways to understand the book. I think one kind of core way to understand what I'm trying to do with it is this book is about how we live. And my aim is to provide people with the inner resources to contend with what we are living through in our world today, and to realize their hopes and dreams. And so it's really about asking ourselves, what do we want? What do we most want in this life? What is the kind of world that we want to build together and leave for our children? And then do we have the resources we need inside, relationally, outside to do that? And how do we start to steer in that direction? So this is from the introduction. Your heart was made for love, for connection, belonging, and meaningful relationship with other people, beings, and the earth. Your heart was made to give and to receive, to know joy, purpose, and freedom. All of this is possible for you and for each of us. Yet painful emotions, ignorance, and oppressive conditions disconnect us from our heart's potential. The Buddha long ago taught that we can shape our inner lives. Whatever the mind frequently thinks upon and ponders, that will become its inclination. Our thoughts, feelings, and intentions grow into habits and over time settle into our character. Contemplative practice roots itself in this power to mold the heart and thus to renew ourselves. Today, we call this neuroplasticity. If we do not shape the heart, the world will do it for us. And the world does not have our highest welfare in mind. The tides of modern society floods us with incessant pressures, demands, and desires. On a personal level, urgency, confusion, and fear spin us in a blur, grind us down, and sap our energy. On a global level, war, social unrest, and a growth-driven economy sweep through our communities, setting us on a course for violence and ecocide. It takes steady, continuous effort to swim against these currents, make choices based on our values, and turn the tide together. Responding effectively depends on training the heart and developing inner resources. We may not recognize it, but we're always practicing something. If you practice feeling anxious, stressed, agitated, you etch those grooves deeper. If you practice patience, kindness, ease, with every moment you grow stronger. In fact, these heart qualities can become your default orientation so that when hardships arise, you draw not on old reactions, but on new strengths. This book guides you to discover and cultivate your best qualities. Some, like attention, energy, you may recognize as universal. Others, like joy or devotion, may seem like things you either have or don't. But contemplative practice and modern neuroscience agree that each of these is an innate capacity that you can enhance, just like any other skill. These qualities are complex, personal aspects of our humanity. To meet our collective challenges and avert disaster, we must transform our hearts and also work at the societal level, applying these qualities globally. For personal and social transformation are inextricably linked. Focusing on internal transformation without also applying our love, our wisdom to the world, we may fail to respond effectively to the suffering of others. Similarly, if we focus solely on external transformation without simultaneously healing our hearts, we risk recreating the very ills we seek to address. How many revolutions have unwittingly replaced one domination system with another? So we strive for individual action and structural change to support each other. Tragically, many efforts for social transformation are subverted by right, wrong thinking, us, them mentalities, cancel culture. Without an internal practice complementing our external work, we can unconsciously reenact dynamics of oppression, patriarchy, white supremacy, and more. So service and social change work allow us to express our love, our compassion for the world. Contemplative practice allows us to align means with end, transforming internalized oppression and integrating our deepest values into social justice spaces. A truly nonviolent approach to social change sees no enemies, only fellow humans who might one day join us in beloved community. Cultivating the qualities shared in this book is one part of the journey to that community. And I will add that learning the skills Roxy teaches in her book is another part to that journey. So I'm curious, Roxy, we've done this a few times. What stood out to you during that passage again and listening?
Yeah. Actually, like you said, I've read the book and we've had this conversation several times, but I was really struck by curiosity about you. So
Mm,
I know. So you have been a priest, you were ordained, you were actually like deeply immersed in a contemplative practice,
yeah,
and now you're kind of out doing a lot in the world. And I'm actually curious about that journey because
yeah,
so many people who are all in on social change don't actually develop the contemplative practice. And so many people who are very much immersed in the more spiritual aspect don't take that step to social change. So
yeah.
what made that possible for you?
I love the question. It's funny too, because as I was reading, I was hearing your book in my mind and appreciating how you start off with some very moving stories, which I don't get to until later. So I'm delighted at the question.
Mm.
Yeah, I think about it from both angles. So starting from the middle, because it's kind of interesting to do that way. When I was living at the monastery in robes after a couple of years, and this was already 15 plus years into my spiritual practice, I went deeper and went to live at the monastery and ordained. What became clear was that there was a part of my heart and my character that was not able to fully express itself within that form, within that
Mm.
form of life. There were some aspects of myself that felt very met and nourished, and found the community, the practice, the structure, the simplicity deeply meaningful.
Mhm.
And then there was these other parts of my heart that at the time really occurred to me as like part of my character that were not being nourished. Core among them was um, a certain quality of deep, heartfelt, intimate relationship that we usually associate exclusively with romantic relationships, but which can occur in many different forms in our lives.
Mhm.
That kind of relational bonding was not being met, and then this deep urge to be involved and give back in a creative way. And so that was the decision to leave the monastery and come back into a lay life. And I met the woman who's now my wife just within 6 months after leaving, and we now have a family
Mm.
together, as you know. But what's interesting, just to then go back to the beginning, I started meditating when I was 19, and this is in the late 90s. And the signs of the environmental crisis were already apparent to those paying
Mhm.
attention. And there was, lived through the wars in Iraq and aware of the income inequality, and I felt a very deep urge to want to have a sense of purpose and meaning in my life in responding to what was happening. And so the question that was burning for me inside was, how can I contribute? What's the best thing I can do with my time? And there was so much confusion and overwhelm and suffering in my own heart that at the time, the thing that seemed the best to do was to try to get clear on what was happening here. And I recognized it was only part of the picture, but it was the part that felt the most urgent and clear to me. And so that's where I started. And I went very deeply into the sense of understanding my own heart and mind and what it is to be human and alive and why we suffer. And then out of that came this movement to share and teach and work and contribute.
I'm really appreciating hearing this, because in the way that you're framing these different aspects of your journey, it's so important that I'm not hearing a right wrong, that, there was one right way to be. And it's really holding the whole, kind of understanding that at different moments in your life, different needs were the ones that were surfacing, and those were the ones you were attending to. So it's really about that attunement to self and being willing to follow and shift, not to stay in this very rigid way of being.
Yeah. And I'll add, there might not have been a strong sense of right, wrong, but there was definitely, particularly in the earlier phases, a lot of angst and a lot of worry and concern and like, am I wasting my time? What am I doing here, meditating, sitting silently when so many people are suffering? And it was very hard to see the trajectory. And there was this process of just really needing to trust my heart, to trust the needs that were alive in the moment that were speaking to me, as we talk about in nonviolent communication.
Well, hearing you say this piece around, what am I doing sitting here meditating when people are suffering? This is in some ways kind of what your book is about. So say a little bit about that. Like, why bring the contemplative practices into
Absolutely
all of the craziness of our world right now?
Yeah. I mean, there are two main things that kind of precipitating forces that led to writing this book. One was the pandemic, and also the year we all had in 2020, as a species, starting with the pandemic and then followed by George Floyd's murder, the wildfires out west. So there was so much pain and overwhelm and uncertainty and instability that, as a meditation teacher, one of the things I felt like I could offer was writing and sharing about how to find inner resources, connect with strength, and meet so much change and so much challenge. And then, so I started writing the book from that perspective. And then about a year later, my wife and I got pregnant. And then the project took on a very different meaning as my connection with future generations became very personal and intimate. And, just today, my wife and I were sitting outside at lunch. She's off on Wednesdays from the hospital, and we're sitting outside, and the wisteria are blooming here, and the bees were buzzing, and the birds are singing. And we were just talking about how eerie and disturbing it is to be alive at this particular moment of history, hearing the sounds of the bees and the birds, and knowing that all of the conditions that support these life forms are threatened and disappearing. And so with that awareness, and thinking of my son and where he'll be, in 20 or 25 years, and where our planet will be, there's this real sense of urgency to say, how do we wake people up? How do we all wake up together and dig deep on the resources that we need to not turn away from the tremendous pain and great risk that we're all facing, not just from climate change, of course, from so many different forces that are all interacting. So that those were the pieces that really ripened this question inside of myself in a very personal way of, what does all this meditation stuff have to do with the times we're living in right now? And how do we bring it into our lives in a very practical way? Particularly as a new parent, I don't have time to meditate for an hour, even half an hour a day. There's so much happening. And yet I can still use my time in a meaningful way and build resources and contribute.
I'm loving hearing you speak about resources, because I think that is the place where so many of us look at all of these challenges and we think there are things out there that we need to get in order to be able to fix it. And your book really invites the reader to see how strengthening all of these different inner resources, all of these practices help us to have the capacity to face these things in a way that's really powerful and necessary. So thank you.
Thank you. So let's hear from you a little bit now.
Yeah, thank you. So my book, How to Have Antiracist Conversation, I love when you said, Oren, that my book actually gives people really practical skills, right? So your book is really about developing some of the inner resources. And my book does that in a way as well. One of the things that I noticed in the many years I've been doing this work is that even when people understand, like, okay, I've learned about racism, I learned about the things I need to be able to say, they really struggle to do it in a way that builds community. There's a lot of, like, you talked about the times we were in where there was a lot of cancel culture. There was a lot of shaming people, and people started to feel paralyzed. I don't know how to have these conversations in a way that can actually still hold care, still have transformation, be effective, but hold care. And so that's what I wanted to address in writing this book. How do I present a model, and I'm drawing very strongly on Kingian nonviolence, how do I present a model that really centers, we're in this together? Whether or not I'm a Black person, a white person, an Indigenous person, we're in it together. We need to have these conversations and work together to create a world where everyone can thrive. And so, as you mentioned, I tell a lot of stories in the book because I think that's what I want people to do. I want people to hear each other's stories and to be able to talk about the difficult things. And so I'm going to start. I'm going to read a little bit of one of the stories today, a story from chapter 1. And this is a story that I experienced when I was a young child. I'm so old now. When I was in my early 20s, that seems like a young child now. So I was in my early 20s and I was in a car and I was in Highway 17 in New York on my way to visit my boyfriend who was living in upstate New York. And a friend was driving. We were having the kind of earnest conversations that 20-year-olds have, just letting our minds wander along with our hearts. And my brother was asleep in the back seat, leaning against the window. And the dark night and blurry scenery wove a cozy cocoon where we could all relax, enjoying each other's company. But my friend and I were startled out of our cozy warmth when flashing lights jolted into view, and a police car had pulled up behind us, following us. Did it want us to pull over? We looked at the speedometer, and we were driving just a mile above the speed limit. So we nervously pulled over onto the side of the road, and the lights and the sudden shift in movement wakened my sleeping brother, and I heard him groggily attempt to make sense of what was going on. "Are we there already?" he asked sleepily from the back seat. The officer tapped on the window before we were able to answer my brother. My friend rolled down the window, and instead of receiving the usual request for license and registration, he was asked to step out of the car. The officer had his hand resting on his gun, and they walked together out of earshot of the car. My brother and I sat in the car, confused and anxious, unable to make sense of what was happening. We watched the officer and my friend talk, at first with visible tension in their bodies. After a few minutes, I saw the tension slowly dissipate. The officer's hand slid off his gun, his shoulders dropped, his posture relaxed. My friend walked back to our car while the officer walked to his, and I was even more confused. When my friend got back in the car, he sat quietly for a little while. The police car drove away, and then my friend started the car and we got back on the road. My brother and I kept asking him about what had happened, but he seemed reluctant to tell us. Finally, he spoke. But I could tell as he was speaking that he was wishing what he was saying wasn't real. The officer saw us passing him on the road. He saw me, a white man, in the driver's seat, and you next to me, a black person. And he saw your brother in the back seat. He wanted to make sure I wasn't being kidnapped. None of us knew what to say. I felt a rush of anger in my body like a slap. But before I could really feel the anger, it became shame. Hot and overwhelming. I felt as though this officer's racism meant I had done something wrong. I could tell my brother was vibrating with anger, but he didn't know how to navigate what had happened either. We were all silent. We didn't talk about any more about it. We turned the radio on and finished the drive in silence. This officer, who had seen black folks and white folks driving together, couldn't conceive of us as being part of the same beloved community. And so I want to just share, just really briefly, a little bit about what I mean by beloved community. So I came to an understanding that resonated with me. Beloved community was, for me, family. Not Norman Rockwell characters who are gathered around a beautiful table full of food, laughing and smiling at each other with no apparent tension or conflict at all. And not the families torn apart by the effects of generations of capitalism and white supremacy ideology, always sniping at each other and jockeying for status. Rather, when I think of family as a metaphor for beloved community, I think of people connected by love for each other whose well-being is intertwined. People who see the full range of each other's human expression, regardless of how we present, angry, sad, happy, scared, in pain. I think of people who know at a visceral level that regardless of how much money, resources, or social capital they have, they cannot be happy if anyone in their family is suffering. I think of people who truly understand interdependence, who know that their capacity to thrive is dependent on the actions of others, just as those others are dependent on them. Beloved community is a world where we see each human as family, where I'm willing to speak up and tell you when your actions have been too costly for me or those around me and invite you to consider a different action. Where I listen when you call me in, inviting me to notice how my actions impact you and those around you. When we are willing to engage in the dance of dialogue, moving between empathy and authentic expression to create a world that works for all. So that's what I'm trying to create to help us be able to build in writing this book. And Oren, what stood out for you hearing this again?
Yeah, beautiful. A few things. I think the first thing that stands out for me, Roxy, especially just given how fractured and divisive the public discourse and the kind of relational field is around so many issues in our world today, is the way you center beloved community and this concept of a kind of deeper family bond that we share as humans. And just the phrase you used when you introduced the book before you started reading, how to center that we're in this together. And that just really struck me as how radical that notion has become today in so many sectors and issues. And so I'm wondering if you could speak just a little bit more about how you understand the process, and perhaps how you talk about it in the book, of moving from a field that is where there is so much separation and really deeply rooted views of the other, to this concept of even introducing the possibility or the vision of we're in this together. How to bridge that gap.
Yeah. So one of the things that's really important for me, because I think you're right, we're living in a world that's incredibly polarized, where like every time I listen to any sort of political discourse, it's a positioning of us versus them, the in group, the out group. And one of the things that I realized was important in us being able to do this work and that I talk about in the book is to understand where that's coming from. Why do we have this very divisive way of thinking about the problems that are impacting all of us? Who's benefiting from white supremacy ideology? Who's benefiting from having me see you as my enemy? And who's not benefiting? And so an important part for me is that we have this basic foundation, this basic knowledge. And so I include in the book a little bit of a primer of how we got to where we are, what is white supremacy? Where did that come from? But I also wanted us to be able to move past that to understand why do we need a different path? And I was so inspired by the work of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and all of the work that led me to be able to have the privilege I have to get the education I have to write this book. And I let that inform a lot of what I do. So what I wanted us to be able to understand is in order to do this work in a way that's transformative, that, you talked about so many social movements um, actually replicating the harms that we're trying to fix. And I wanted us to also be able to address racism, address these conversations in a way that's transformative, that doesn't continue the us versus them dynamic. And so a lot of the book is around helping us understand the importance of beloved community, the importance of this framing of how do we understand our shared humanity? How do we understand what nonviolent communication brings us to consider? That we all have the same needs and we have many different strategies to meet our needs. But if we can find a way to understand what's motivating you, we have a shared language to talk about. Here's what I need from you. Here's what I can offer. Here's how we can transform the situation so that we're all thriving. And that's an important part of the work that I need to be able to own. I'm taking an action because I have needs, and you're taking an action, even if I disagree with it, because you have needs. So let's have a conversation on what's a strategy that's going to work for both of us.
Yeah. Yeah. One of the things I'm hearing, and tell me if this is right, just like listening to the way you're describing that process, understanding how we got here and the importance of beloved community, the framework of universal human needs, and really connecting with our own humanity and the full range of our needs, is that it sounds like, and so I'm wanting to check out, that part of what makes it possible to bridge that gap is the inner work that each of us committed to this vision can do, so that we are actually embodying, existing in, and coming from a different place inside in how we approach another person or a conversation. Am I getting that piece right?
Absolutely. And so that's like the first third of the book is really helping people to understand what that inner work is and guiding them through the questions to consider that help us to hold that consciousness.
Yeah.
And because I wanted the book to be really practical, it's like this inner work is the foundation, but we also need the tools and skills of like, okay, so now that I get it, now that I believe in beloved community, what do I actually say to this person who's calling me a racist slur as they walk down the street? How do I have these conversations when microaggressions happen? And so there's a whole model that I present on these are the steps that you can take to move us from this inner work to this outer discourse.
Yeah. Which is so essential, right? It's one of the missing pieces, particularly for those who are on some kind of transformative spiritual healing path, or have a vision of a world with dignity and human rights for all, as how to actually translate that into action, into relationship. So the next question that occurred to me as I was listening to you, that's kind of a perfect segue from what you're saying, I think, is, so you talk about the tools that you share, and you have this beautiful model of authentic dialogue with so much clarity and guidance for people in how to understand these conversations in different ways and walk through them. I think one of the places that I see a lot of people getting hung up, that seems like a real kind of choice point, in navigating these conversations is, how do we discern when to invest in creating the conditions to really hear one another or try to do it differently and have some sort of authentic dialogue?
Mm-hmm.
And how do we choose to let it be and prioritize other needs? How do you
Yeah.
talk about that discernment and what,
Oh,
yeah.
that's a great question. And what I love about that question, especially like I'm thinking of myself and other global majority folks right now,
Yeah.
is that I can't have all of these conversations. If I were to address every single microaggression I experience, that's all I would be doing. And there's so much more I want to do with my life. And so this question of discernment is really important. And for me, it comes back to the inner work. It comes back to understanding, what is it that I need in this moment? What's important to me in this moment? And being willing to say, you know what? Like, I've had people come to me and say, hey, I'd love to have this conversation with you. I think I caused harm. And I don't want to have this conversation because it's not serving me. So being willing to recognize, what are my needs in this moment? And I can stand for those. I can advocate for getting my needs met. And it might mean sometimes that I want to have this conversation. Sometimes I would say, no, I actually want to put my energy somewhere else. One of the things I talk about is not just discerning, do I want to have this conversation, but a really big missing piece I discovered is what conversation I want to have. Because a lot of times we jump into, I just want to be heard about what's going on. And the other person's like, actually, no, I don't want, I really want to find a solution. I don't want to just talk. I want to make sure that we get to a really concrete action that we could take. And if we're trying to have different conversations, people walk away thinking, what just happened? No one got their needs met. So having clarity about what's the conversation you want to have is an important part of what I invite people to consider as they read the books.
Yeah. And I love how present that consciousness and inner work is throughout the dialogue process in your book, right? That it's not just this kind of thing you do beforehand or something separate that you prepare and then here are these conversations tools, but it's actually woven throughout.
Absolutely. And I would actually love to see if there are audience comments. Like, it's so juicy to hear from our audience, and I appreciate the comments, like just the appreciations of the book so far. So if you're listening and you have a question for us, we'd love to hear it.
And you can address your question to either one of us or generally, and then Roxy and I will either take turns or kind of, riff off one another. And maybe Roxy, while we're waiting, I can offer one more follow-up question.
Yeah.
On your book. So one of the things that I think can be so challenging about having these very real, difficult conversations that are so important in our lives, in our world today, is how politicized even certain terms have become.
Yes.
Right. So even saying something like privilege or white supremacy or even racism can carry a whole set of associations and worldviews and meanings. So how do you suggest that readers and those wanting to implement the teachings and the process you offer understand the potential and the pitfalls for connection or disconnection in that kind of a field, and make choices about terms and when and how to use them?
Thank you so much for this question, because this is something that comes up so often. Yes, absolutely. Certain words are divisive. Like if I say you have privilege, or this is an example of privilege, or that was racist, some people shut down. But what I always ask people to consider is, who is benefiting and who are we centering when we decide certain language is okay to use and certain language is not okay to use. I think it's really helpful that we use the language, especially the language of the people who are harmed and the people who are marginalized. And if I said to you, Oren, hey, Oren, this thing that you just said or did was racist, it might be a really hard message for you to hear. But I want to have the freedom, and I want to invite everyone to have the freedom to speak the language that's authentic to them. It's not about policing a certain kind of language. And if I say that to you, and I notice you're kind of going, wait a second, I'm really lost, I'm confused, then I slow down. Then I say, okay, so you don't actually get what I mean by racist in this moment. Let me tell you what you did specifically that was hard for me. So I can slow down and make sure that we have the same understanding. But a lot of times when we insist that people not use that language and only use words that are comfortable for the people who are doing harm to hear, we're basically saying we want to prioritize their comfort over the authentic expression and the lived reality of the people who are saying, no, actually, that is what racism means, or that's what a microaggression is. So I really love to invite us to both speak your truth, check in and see if message sent was message received. And if someone says a word that's hard for you, try to understand, what are they wanting me to hear by this, rather than dismissing the message because the language is hard for you.
Yeah. And I so enjoy the way, even in that response, how you're kind of holding the needs of both, right? It's this really kind of intricate, beautiful way of honoring and acknowledging in these kind of two subjectivities in this whole field of history and conditions and powerful forces, to say how to start from a place that is taking all of that into account, honoring the needs, the harm, the authenticity of the person who is holding the most pain or need in that moment, and still hold care for and respond to the needs of the other person based on what's actually alive and true in the moment.
Right.
Rather than coming from a fixed position or idea, preferencing one over the other in some kind of static way.
Exactly. And for me, it's really important that it is a living and responsive way of dialogue, not the rules and checkboxes that I'm following.
Yeah.
I see there's a question, though, for you in the chat. So I really want to pause and invite you to look at that question.
Yeah. So
So,
Sarah, do you want to read it?
Sure. So Sarah asked, is it durable to practice mindfulness when faced with incredibly stressful situations, or is it realistic to practice mindfulness when we're stressed?
Yeah, that's such a great question. I think it depends on what we mean by mindfulness and what our goals and expectations are. I think that mindfulness has been interpreted in the popular sphere to mean a certain kind of calming practice, or one with a very kind of narrow focused attention. So if I'm practicing mindfulness, I'm kind of focusing attention in this way, and I'm kind of blocking other things out, which is actually more a form of concentration than mindfulness. Mindfulness supports that, but that's not how I would define mindfulness. Or mindfulness is this kind of centering, calming experience I have, which again is not how I would define mindfulness. Mindfulness can support that, but that's called calm or tranquility. So mindfulness is the capacity to be aware of what's happening in a balanced and open or curious way. So the power of mindfulness is that it doesn't take the shape of what it's aware of. So in this sense, yes, we can practice mindfulness when we're stressed or overwhelmed, and it actually can be really beneficial because it starts to give us some perspective, and that gives us access to our wisdom and other resources to address and respond to that stress. So at the same time, I would add that mindfulness practice doesn't mean sitting still and focusing on your breathing, that we really can have a very broad and wide understanding of what mindfulness means. It means a natural, balanced awareness. And so if I recognize that I'm feeling really stressed and overwhelmed, that recognition itself is a seed of mindfulness. And then how do I take that seed of mindfulness, deepen it, and then respond appropriately and recognize I need to call a friend or I need to take a walk. So it opens the door to having other choices and options, because now instead of just the stress and overwhelm, there's also a sense of an accompaniment and awareness with it, which can lead to so many other responses.
So I'm appreciating hearing, especially some of the distinctions you're making between like calm and tranquility and these pieces. And there's another question that I think might really, I want to ask this question out of order just because I think it helps to build on what you're talking about. So Joshua says, I teach mindfulness in Rikers Prison. How do I employ the language and practices that are most relevant to individuals who are marginalized in prison, partially because they are people of color? So this feels like another version of like looking
Yeah.
at specific environmental stressors.
Yeah, thanks, Joshua. Thank you for your work, first of all. Individual. So there's a concept I'm sure you're familiar with, Joshua, that comes out of later Buddhist traditions called skillful means, which is kind of just a fancy way of saying what works and what speaks to people. And I think this is one of the arts of teaching. It's part of the art of communicating. So in the example that Roxy gave, where if I did something that stimulated pain, and Roxy said, Orin, that was pretty racist, and I got defensive, and she said, oh, I can see you don't mean what I meant by that. Here, let me give you more information. That ability to say, let me put this in terms that you can understand, right? So I think that there's a translation process of looking at how do we understand the essence of whatever practice you're wanting to offer, and share stories, examples that create relevance, right? It has to speak to the experience and the needs of those who are listening. I'm reaching for, but not finding more specifics than that. But I think that, drawing from and looking at others who are doing similar work, like forgetting some of the names of the other prison mindfulness projects, but I'm sure you're aware of them, and looking at those resources for ways of framing the practice. I mean, I think one of the core metaphors for mindfulness practice and meditation that can be most relevant to those on the inside is the metaphor of prison. And there's the outer prison, and then there's the inner prison of the mind. And when we're unable to affect the circumstances around us of the outer prison, how do we understand and recognize the prisons that we create in our own minds in terms of the way we're thinking about ourselves or others, the regret that we carry, the self-judgment, the anger, these kinds of forces that perpetuate a kind of quality of hardness and disconnection in the heart. And so that's like one example, I think. And there would be many for each kind of practice or quality or teaching. I'm wondering what you would add to that, Roxy.
It's not so much what I would add. There's actually something that's coming up as I hear you. And it might be like another riff on Joshua's question, which is something around how do you see mindfulness and like the larger contemplative practices specifically helping people to respond to these larger systemic, challenges, like racism is a thing and discrimination is a thing, poverty is a thing. So yeah.
I think there's a few ways. The first, of course, is that the more aware we are, the more we're practicing, whether it's mindfulness or kindness or compassion, but just developing any of these inner resources. We're, in one sense, we're kind of like we're removing the poison from our own heart that we've been infected with through generations of oppression and internalized harm. So we're kind of we're healing those forces from the inside out. That's one very, I think, important benefit of contemplative practices for those working against systems of oppression and harm and social change. and however they affect us directly or indirectly. A second is that they give us, they enhance our access to an enduring and powerful source of energy. It's not the only source of energy, but they amplify and enhance our access to our values, our vision, our ancestors, future generations. Wherever we're drawing strength from, the more present we are and the kind of clearer our own vessel and channel is, the more we can allow that to move through us. And finally, I think that these practices of contemplation, of developing all of the qualities that I share in Your Heart Was Made for This, starting with attention and aspiration and moving into mindfulness and energy and concentration and beyond, they allow us to be so much more powerful and effective in anything and everything we do. And the way I talk about it is, it's like we have each been gifted this amazing instrument of a human mind and body. And the core notes are these beautiful qualities of the heart: joy and generosity and resolve and compassion and ease and wonder. And can we play those notes? Can we form chords? Can we build melodies? So it's learning how to play the instrument of the human heart and spirit, and that turns us into a force for change, so that in any conversation, situation, group, community, movement we're a part of, we have that much more to offer and can be that much more effective.
Thank you, Oren. And I think there's a question here for me that I want to answer.
Yeah.
And so Soraya asks, how do you think awareness of cultural differences can enhance cross-cultural communication skills? And this is always, I love this question because it's one that the flip side of the question is people saying, well, I could never learn everything, right? I can't learn every single cultural difference that exists. So am I lost? Am I stuck? And I think it's exactly the opposite. It's like just becoming aware of cultural differences, even if I don't master like every single possible cultural difference there is between my group and another group, just having the openness in our heart to say that my way of being in the world, my value system, my framing, the perspectives I take is only one possible way of being, means that I'm going to be curious. And curiosity for me is an essential part of cross-cultural communication skills. It means I'm not going to be rigid and immediately demonizing the other person. I'm going to share what my truth is, and I'm going to follow that up with, but that's my experience. Tell me a bit about what it was like for you. Tell me a bit about what am I missing or what have I not seen? And so I think awareness and it makes it possible for us to recognize that there are many possibilities out there, many perspectives out there, and that we can walk towards that. And that is a huge enhancement for anything that we try to do to create bridges across cultures and identities.
That's beautiful. Thank you, Roxy.
Okay, and then there was another question. And Al Moth asked, to what extent can or should we encourage others, even people on the far side of a political divide from us, to pick up mindful approaches of their own? Is this possible, and should it be a focus?
I like this question, and I think we could broaden it and say, like, with either of the approaches our books are offering, right? Whether it's a mindful approach or the authentic dialogue approach, right? Like, to what degree is this something to offer, invite, encourage others who are not already interested? Would you be willing to start, Roxy?
Absolutely. Yes. Because what's important for me is that I don't know that I need you to have learned this approach and mastered it in order for me to use it and to use it effectively. And so the question is, should we encourage other people to do it? Absolutely. The more people who are looking at this work and exploring these concepts, I think the more robust the conversations can get. But one of the beauties of this conversation is that I benefit from the inner work, from my understanding of my needs, and from my capacity to think about your needs and to find strategies that are going to work for both of us. So even if you don't do anything with this work, I can still change the field in the way that I'm approaching it. So do I want to encourage you to do it? Absolutely. Is it necessary? No.
I love that. So simple and clear and direct. And what the only thing I would add, I would, I'm relieved that you went first, because now I can just say ditto for the mindfulness piece. And I think the other piece that I've seen in both modalities, whether we're talking about nonviolent communication and your authentic dialogue approach, or practicing mindfulness, is that when we're really living the practice, whichever practice we're talking about, or we're bringing them together in fabulous ways, unless someone is really, really disconnected, frightened, shut down, people feel it. They recognize that there's something different happening. Mm-hmm. And that sparks interest, curiosity. It changes something, because they can feel that we're not relating in the usual way, that we've somehow stepped outside of the frameworks and the norms and the habits that keep us locked in this us, them, either or, right, wrong, get ahead mentality. And I think it stimulates a yearning, a longing, or at least a wondering inside. And I think that's also the part of the power of these practices, and a way that we can encourage others to take them up or be interested in them, when explicit means of encouragement are either not possible or not welcome, that the implicit way of encouraging it is living the practice.
Mm-hmm. So there's one last question. I'm not sure. The question is, what would Martin Luther King and the Buddha say about our current state of affairs? Honestly, I think there would just be grief and mourning. It would be a recognition of just the real tragedy that we have created systems and societies that are so divisive, that prevent us from seeing each other. And it would be a continued commitment to seeing the human in each person, seeing the humanity and trusting in that, and continuing to move towards, to speaking up against injustice, to saying, this is not okay. If anyone is suffering, I am not okay. But to do it from a place of grief and mourning, and a commitment to bring us all together into the fold.
Yeah. The image that came to me first was the modern image of the weeping Buddha, the Buddha with his face in his hands weeping. And the other thing that stands out to me is that my sense is that both of them had such a powerful depth of understanding and analysis of how and why we suffer, that the grief and the mourning would be accompanied by a certain kind of wisdom, a certain a lack of bewilderment, because there's an understanding of the causes of how we got here that are driving the tremendous pain in our world.
Yeah. Oh, I wish we had more time. There's one last question that's beautiful, but I'll try to write something about the risk of bypassing difficult emotions, because that's definitely an important part. But I so enjoy opportunities to chat with you, Oren.
Yeah, this has been really rich. Thanks, Roxy and Jacob, and thank you everyone who joined us this evening. It's a real pleasure to be here.
Mm-hmm.
Thanks for joining us for Branches of Wisdom. a podcast of Banyan Books and Sound, Canada's spiritual and healing resource since 1970. Our podcast producer is Jacob Steele. The show is edited by Abdo Habani. Watch all our conversations on YouTube by searching for Banyan Books, or listen on your favorite podcast platform. Please subscribe, follow, like, and leave your reviews and comments. We love to hear from you. For all our live events, books, and more, visit us at banyan.com.